let's do a little thought experiment. There's an old expression, and I'm probably going to butcher it here: never attribute to malice what can otherwise be explained by incompetence. Why I mention that is in relation to the hot button topic, the big issue here in Ireland and most of Western Europe at the moment, uncontrolled mass immigration from all parts of the globe. Why it's happening, what to do about it, and why most Western governments, in particular our government, are doing nothing about it. They're facilitating it. They seem to be even encouraging it. Well, a lot of people, including me, think about these things, for good or ill, and we wonder, well, why is this happening? What's behind it? What's the reason? And where is it going to end? And what's the end goal, if there even is an end goal? There are many schools of thought on this, and I've seen and read and heard a lot of them, if not them all. Everything ranges from complete and utter incompetence on the part of the politicians, right to the other end of the spectrum, where you have people saying, no, it's a grand conspiracy. It's actually a very coherent and put together strategy to import UN soldiers, UN secretive operatives who can then mobilise and take over the country on behalf of some new world order, or Klaus, what's his name, the WEF, globalist government and all that sort of stuff. Now, where do I fall into all this? And I have thought about it, and I was watching a video this morning by New Ada. You should check him out on YouTube. He makes a lot of videos and he talks a lot of sense, and he was talking about this, what is going on and what should we make of it and what's the real reasons for it. And it got me thinking, and I thought about it a bit, and this is where my thoughts went. First of all, I would fall into the camp of it's happening because a combination of putting out huge incentives to people who have little or no resources in primitive, backward and brutal parts of the world to come here for free stuff, essentially. That's a huge lure for anybody who lives in that situation and in those parts of the world. So that would explain why you'd have a mass movement in an age of mass transit, where it's quite easy to get from one part of the world to another relatively quickly. Add to that a political class that is completely incompetent. There's just no leadership there. You look at a lot of the politicians now, they have no world experience at all. A lot of them have never even had a real job. You look at the leader of the country, Simon Harris, the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, they've never actually had a job, either of them. Never had a real job. They're just politicians, always have been, from the get-go. No wealth of experience, no well of life experience, having come up through ranks, having built a career or even worked in a career, risen through ranks, started something, made something, created. No, nothing like that. No well to draw on. They just are political people. They only know politics. So you're starting from there. What could they possibly know? What ideas could they possibly have? And even if they had ideas, what mental fortitude, what backbone would they have built up over years of experience and grind to even enact those ideas? Well, the answer is none of the above. They don't have any ideas, I don't think. And even if they had ideas, they just simply don't have the gravitas. They don't have the life experience. They haven't been at the coal face, in the trenches, getting up early, going to work on a bike in the rain, day in, day out, grinding through the hardship to build that fortitude that then enables you to push forward with some degree of vigour, the things you believe in, the ideas you might have. It's a certain steeliness that's not there in the politicians we have. So they're empty vessels, and they're essentially just glove puppets for bigger powers. I mean the EU and global corporations. That's who runs Ireland. The politicians who are in the Dáil in the Parliament are simply just hand puppets for those. So I would fall into the camp that this whole catastrophe, this whole migration crisis, which is the number one hot button topic in Ireland today, is a combination of putting out signals worldwide via tweets from government ministers and other communications that Ireland welcomes everybody and we have loads of resources to give away, added to a level of sheer incompetence as to when the hordes do arrive, having no idea what to do about it. And even if they had an idea to try and do something about it, they simply don't have the fortitude and the gravitas of character to carry it through in the face of opposition from the EU and, say, global corporations. But here's the other thing. I'm not saying I know the answers to why it's happening or how it could even be stopped. But let's do a little thought experiment, because whilst I don't buy into the whole, it's a secretive UN army coming in through the back door. No, I think that would take a huge amount of organisation and coordination, and I just don't think we have the people for that. I just don't think we even have the expertise for that. I just don't think they're that smart. But what about this? And now, I'm not advocating for anything, and I'm not saying I know, but I would just like to posit this. Walk with me a little bit on this one. So, you end up with this situation where large numbers, unprecedented numbers of mostly, the vast majority of young, military-aged men from all corners of the globe, between, say, 18 and 40, for example, mostly young men, they're arriving in en masse. And they're being put into these encampments, which you can see behind me. They're building them now at scale. Started off with bed and breakfasts, chalets, little, small hotels, buildings, but now they're industrializing it into what, if you know anything about history, looks to all intents and purposes like military barracks, especially the old Roman-style military barracks. If you've ever seen programs or historical programs about the Roman army on campaign, this is exactly the type of thing they built when their army was off campaigning in foreign lands. They built places exactly like this. So let's throw in another thing on top. These people are coming in, the government is allowing them to come in. Ireland today, and I have said this on numerous occasions on this channel, there is an undercurrent, a deep-seated anger and frustration in the general populace. It's bubbling away under the surface about how the country is being transformed in radical ways and at a pace that is simply frightening to most of the natives. In fact, going by all the opinion polls. It's not a secret anymore. They can't hide it anymore. Every opinion poll now says that over 70%, it could be higher even, either want immigration capped or stopped or controlled, brought down to a level that we can handle so that integration can happen. The government, point blank, refuses to even acknowledge that there's a problem. So we're not even at the possible solution stage. We haven't even got to there's a problem stage. That is causing the anger, this underlying deep-seated bubbling away tension and anger to ferment. And the longer the government ignores the problem, the worse this bubbling anger gets, and the more of a tinderbox it becomes. Now, if you think, well, you just vote out the government and you vote in a new government, problem solved. That doesn't work either, because Sinn Féin, the so-called opposition, and the small parties, they're all set to continue what's going on now. So you can't even, on current parameters, vote out the government and get a new government that'll do what people want. You vote in a new government and they continue on with this deeply hated policy, if not make it worse. I think if Sinn Féin get in, you'll see 1 million Palestinians from Gaza arrive in the next 6 months. It could be that crazy. You think it can't get worse, but believe me, it could get worse. So if I was one of the backroom boys or one of the people in the regime, not necessarily one of the main politicians, but maybe one of the people running the show, people who actually pull the strings, the smart people, or the smartest people we've got, I'd be worried that this bubbling away deep-seated anger could at some point ignite. It's a tinderbox. And the more the government ignore the vast majority of the ordinary people, the more of a tinderbox this becomes. In effect, the government, the regime, whether it be this government or the next government, which will be some kind of patchwork quilt of what we've got now, maybe with a few people bolted on and a few people dropped off the side, but it'll be basically the same shape. Well, the longer that chasm is allowed to exist between the government and the population, the more is a potential for the tinderbox to just ignite. All it takes is a spark. I think most of us have seen the footage of the last days of Ceausescu in Romania, where one day he's up giving a speech to the masses, as he had done thousands of times before, but this deep-seated anger and frustration was always there, but they'd kept a lid on it. But this day there was rumblings in the crowd. The rumblings got worse, and all of a sudden rebellion, outright revolt broke out, just like that. Couldn't be stopped, and it was over within a day or two, and he was put up against the wall, and we know what happened. He was shot. End of story. It can happen that quick. Now, if you're one of the smart people in a regime and you know that the regime is completely ignoring the will of your own native people, what do? You become vulnerable to things happening. Let's just say there's a depression, a recession, loads of people lose their jobs, suddenly there's a mass of people out on the streets. So for that reason, it brings many people out onto the streets in discontent. Now, this is maybe a discontent added to the other bubbling discontents that have been fermenting and building for years. But now you've got people en masse in O'Connell Street or in front of the Dáil. There's a potential for things to spark off there, because there's plenty of tinder for a spark to take hold. So what do? Your contingency plan: call in the army, call in the police. Okay, but here's the problem with that. Number one, we have a tiny army. Tiny, puny. I think it's about 6,000 personnel. It could be even less than that now, because we never needed an army. And the police force too is very small, and it's unarmed, and half of them are women. So when it comes to getting stuck into a physical riot situation or a full-on revolt situation, you've only got half the police force and they're unarmed, and you've got an army which is tiny. And that's not even considering maybe a lot of members in both the police and the army might also be sympathetic to the uprising, shall we call it. So they mightn't even come out. Many of these situations depend on which side the army goes for. Sometimes the army splits, sometimes it goes both directions, or it might just stay in barracks. It might say, look, we're having nothing to do with this. We're not coming out to crack heads of our own people, because maybe they have a point. Well, that's the end of the regime. But let's throw another thing into the mix. What if you could call on a latent standing army almost instantly? Let's go back to the barracks situation. So what you have now is a group of men, a mass group of men, tens of thousands of young, military age men from parts of the globe where military service was perhaps normal. So you have a lot of these men who may have already got military service. You have a lot of these men who maybe even fought in various conflicts. So they have not only military service, but active service. And they're all easy to contact, on site, spread around the country, and could, in an instant, be mobilized by a regime, be mobilized by the government, the regime. Think about how easy this would be. First of all, they're all already on site, they're all already in the country, and they're all already together. They don't have to travel anywhere, you don't have to recruit them, they're just there, ready to go. First thing you do, you offer them a package. Minister for Justice comes out and says maybe something like this: if you join the regime to help put down the fascist far-right revolt, we'll give you instant citizenship. Easily done. The Minister for Justice just has to sign a thing. And that's it. Instant amnesty for all asylum claims, for anyone who joins, for anyone who fights for the regime. Number 2, you give some financial incentives, because remember, the regime, doesn't matter how legitimate or illegitimate it is, still controls the country's, the nation's finances. It has access to all the bank accounts. It's got the money. So you offer a financial package to men who have no money. Number 3, you perhaps offer them, in addition to instant citizenship, perhaps when this all blows over, a home, an apartment, a house, a piece of land. How many of those men sitting in the international protection facilities would put their hand up and say, I'm in? And remember this, these men have absolutely no ties or allegiances or even connection, both emotionally or physically, to the native population. They'd be completely divorced and separate. They'd have no emotional baggage. They'd have no fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts or uncles to connect them in. They're completely mercenary. Ireland or the native Irish would mean nothing to them. They may as well be from planet Mars. And on top of that, the regime who's paying them tells them, you are on the side of the righteous. We are the legitimate government, and this rabble are nothing more than fascists, thugs, far-right Nazis. They need to be crushed. Can you imagine the brutality that could ensue? Can you imagine the carnage that could ensue? Could you imagine? It would make anything the British over 700 years did in this country look like a picnic. Because remember, a lot of these men come from some of the most brutal societies and brutal parts of the world. If they were unleashed on a native population, it would be an absolute horror show. And the government, should it want to, could mobilise this latent army in hours. Just like the old Western movies where the sheriff gets into a bit of a pickle, a bit of a spot with some gang of outlaws. Well, he just calls the shopkeeper and the blacksmith and a couple of other lads around the town and says, I hereby deputise you. Put on this badge, put on this star. And he hands them all out. You are now hereby deputised to ride with me in a posse. So those men were a blacksmith the day before or shopkeeper. The next day, they are deputised, legitimate enforcers of the state with the full resources of the state behind them. It could be done that easily with tens of thousands of men who have no connection or allegiance to the native people here, on behalf of a government that could no longer command the respect of the people, the support of the people, to the point where the people rebelled. Just a thought experiment. Is this perhaps what could be going on? Is this perhaps one element or possibility of what could be going on? Does it sound like it's feasible? Does it sound like it's realistic? Could we ever end up in such a situation? But what is not in any doubt, and what is beyond any dispute, is that firstly, Ireland is being transformed on a scale and at a pace that is unprecedented. And 2, it's beyond dispute that the vast majority of ordinary Irish people don't want this and are dead set against this. Those things are not in dispute and are not up for question. It's just the reality of Ireland in the present day. And I think it's by no means a conspiracy theory. If you look all throughout history, in all parts of the world, that when a government, be it a king, be it a democracy, be it a communist state, When a government divorces itself, distances itself, alienates itself from the ordinary population, it becomes a powder keg, a potential flashpoint. And if I've thought of this, you can be absolutely sure far smarter people than me have also thought of it.